Guralnik, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan Harris. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. I thought I would start with psychoanalysis because this is a bit of malpractice on my part because I don't actually think after 8 years and 700 episodes we've really ever talked about what psychoanalysis is. Let's just start with what is it and how's it different from the therapy that many of us are already doing or may have already experienced?
Sure. Psychoanalysis is a very serious project that aims to help patients, people, but the world at large understand unconscious forces that operate on us. The psychoanalysis, as far as a therapeutic process, is a process in which patients come in and spend a long time with their therapist. They come sometimes multiple times a week. I sometimes see people 3-4 times a week.
Wow.
Sometimes they lie on the couch. And the treatment usually goes on for quite a while because we try to really go deep and really understand why things are happening in people's lives that they are not aware of. We use the process of the therapy as one of the labs that we look into. So the relationship with the analyst is very important in psychoanalysis, and we use it to it's sort of another realm of experience that helps us understand what goes on with the patient. We talk a lot about history, about early history, sometimes about even transgenerational history. And in more contemporary types of psychoanalysis, we also talk about the wider context, like sociopolitical factors and how they kind of infiltrate the unconscious. So it's a serious endeavor.
Why would someone opt for 2-3 times a week psychoanalysis over garden varieties, talk to a therapist once every week or every other week?
First of all, there's plenty of good things you can do in once a week therapy. There are all kinds of therapies out there, and they're good for many things. I mean, if you have like a spider phobia, or if you have like a particular kind of pernicious thought that keeps going in your mind, you can get some cognitive behavioral help. There are many ways to help all sorts of things that trouble people. Psychoanalysis really aims to go deeper and change deeper patterns in the psyche. You know, the same way that advice is sometimes feels kind of good in the moment, but it's not really useful because things go on and you have your patterns and you keep going back to your old patterns, and you can say to yourself whatever you want consciously. The old patterns will take hold of you again and again and again. You need to find a process to kind of delve deeper into these older patterns or like these deeper patterns and tackle them from that place. If you want a deeper dive into yourself and more change, you have to invest the time and effort into it. Aside from all of that, it's really interesting. It's just really interesting, like what goes on in our mind, like what goes on under the surface. It's the same question of like, in certain ways, like why is it a deeper experience to read a full novel as opposed to like a blog post? It's just more interesting.
So it's not the case that psychoanalysis is only indicated for people who are deeply troubled. It's actually for and maybe some of those people would fit the bill for psychoanalysis, but it's really for anybody who's deeply curious.
Yes, that's one way to say it. You know, in more traditional psychoanalysis, people used to say that you need a certain level of what we call ego strength to go through analysis. Nowadays, we've expanded the way we do psychoanalysis, and we include people that suffer from, let's say, more troubling conditions. But it used to be that you needed to be sophisticated, well enough put together to endure the turbulence of psychoanalysis, because it's an intense process. But nowadays, we've changed the technique. We do things differently. So it could be for anyone who's curious, anyone who's willing, anyone who has the time and means.
Just going back to what you said before about how, you know, if you really want to understand why you're suffering now, you need to dive into all of the causes and conditions. in your subconscious. You also mentioned the transgenerational subconscious, which I want to come back to. So are you saying that if we're not doing psychoanalysis, we're really missing out on something that can provide us a more full level of happiness?
I agree with most of what you said, and I know we're on a 10% happier podcast. I am not sure happiness is the exact thing I'm talking about, although
Okay.
hopefully it's woven in there. I would say we're missing out on knowing more about truth, about the reality of who we are, knowing more about what's in front of us. Psychoanalysis helps you see reality in a much richer way. It's not always a happier picture, but it's a fuller, richer, more honest picture. Sometimes happier.
Since you brought it up, I'll take the bait. My view of happiness is not jumping up in the air, joy. It's a sort of a holistic, capacious understanding of a life well lived.
Yeah. Can I ask you questions?
Of course.
In your view, what is the relationship between happiness and truth?
I think there's a deep relationship between happiness and truth. And I come out of the Buddhist tradition. So in Buddhism, there's this massive emphasis on mortality, finitude. You're going to die. And that's an uncomfortable truth. But liberation lies in the direction of embracing what ultimately will destroy you.
From the little I know of Buddhism, and I've studied some, and I meditate myself, so I think there are a lot of commonalities between psychoanalysis and the practice of Buddhism, and a kind of search for getting beyond the noise level of things and kind of soaking into like the deeper layer.
Yes. That was immediately what came to mind for me when you were talking about, you didn't use the term causes and conditions, but that's a very Buddhist term, understanding all of what has led us to this moment, what's informing both our conscious mind and our subconscious mind. That is at least to the extent to which I understand Buddhism, that is a very Buddhist approach. Although in Buddhism, we don't tend to focus too much on the details of our childhood, but it is about understanding what leads to what. And that's what karma is, cause and effect.
Yeah. And then I know that in certain, in certain types of Buddhism, there's plenty of attention to like the past, even like, reincarnation and like big pasts.
Yes.
So
and future.
There is some idea that there is things that are driving us from behind. There's wind from behind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I kind of think of it as like everybody's got this vapor trail behind them, like of all of so many, this incalculable gumbo of causes and conditions that have produced our mind state and behavior right now.
Yeah. And isn't it fascinating? And I think in a moment like this, like when we're like in this like very, very particular moment in history, it feels very useful to like be able to have tools to try to look at reality.
Say more about that.
Well, we're in a moment in history, I mean, both in this country, but elsewhere in the world, where there's like crisis, compounding crisis and all sorts of, it's a very violent time, violent in many ways, literally violent on the lives of people, violent on our minds, violent between us. It's a time of great chaos and distortion, noise, misunderstanding. And I think having certain tools to try to sift through signal and noise and find a way both internally but also in viewing reality is incredibly helpful. I assume you feel similarly about like meditation practice.
I do, and many other practices. I kind of, to the extent that anybody knows who the hell I am, I think it's kind of, I would be pegged as the meditation guy. But over the course of this part of my career, post writing about meditation and getting some attention for it, I've really broadened out to all the modalities that can help one do life better. So I'm not a meditation fundamentalist by any stretch.
Can you say more? Like
Well,
about the different what you're calling modalities?
yeah, I think there's like a pantheon of no-brainers, evidence-based levers one can pull to improve the quality of one's mind and life. So sleep, exercise, eating well, with the caveat that you don't want to be too, and I would put this caveat, this asterisk next to exercise too, that you don't want to fall into the orthorexia trap, the unhealthy obsession with being healthy. Nature, beauty generally, medication if you need it, meditation, meaningful work, and then probably most importantly, from my understanding of the data, is the quality of your relationships. And under that, there's a whole set of skills too, from communication skills to how you talk to yourself and how that redounds to how you're talking to other people. And yeah, so I just see this as just a big menu of skills that you can train to be better at life. Does that rhyme with how you see the world?
It to some degree does. I have like two sort of general thoughts in response to that. I mean, in addition to, first of all, yes to all of that. As a psychoanalyst, because of my training and because of what I'm interested in, I always feel like there's all the stuff we know with a capital K, or the things we think we know and the practices we think will lead us to the good thing. And then there's always this kind of unconscious thing that's bubbling underneath that knowing too well how to live is going to block us from that in a certain way, that you have to keep a certain ear and attention to all the unpredictable and all the stuff that, you sleep well, you eat well, you this, that, and the other, and then you're like still rattled, or your mind goes somewhere else, or all sorts of surprising things happen, or the world just comes at you in a way that is, I've done all these things and look, it's still like we're in a mess. I have one ear towards the messy, unpredictable part that always emanates from within us and from outside of us. So that on one hand, maybe it's not a different thought. I'm always a little suspicious of knowing too well how to do things. I'm always worried that we're, I don't know, in the claws of the next big thing, whether it's like the new pharma that's out there, the new app that's out there, the new AI technology that's out there to optimize us. So I have kind of a built-in yes, but. So.
I'm foursquare in your camp, I think, on both of those. In the first one, you don't want to get overly sort of programmatic about this. Oh, well, so X podcaster is saying I should do Y thing first thing in the morning, and that's going to fix everything. No, that would be to ignore all of the causes and conditions we were discussing earlier that contribute to what's happening on a conscious level, and probably more importantly, perhaps from your point of view, the subconscious level.
Yeah.
So yes. And then in the second, which is I think deeply related, this idea that if you know what to do, quote unquote, it's like in some way kind of blinding you, and there's a kind of dogmatism that can set in. And within Buddhism itself, there's kind of an elasticity. And again, I don't want to overly emphasize Buddhism. I'm taken by it, but I'm not. It's not an evangelistic tradition. In Zen Buddhism, this idea of don't know mind, beginner's mind. And the Buddha talked a lot about how he was an analyst, not a dogmatist. So and he specifically said, which makes him quite unique among quote unquote religious figures. I think we can debate whether he was a religious figure. He specifically said, don't take anything I say at face value. Come see for yourself. Check it out in the laboratory of your own mind. And so it works well for me as a journalist and as a skeptic who's always, as you are, alert to what am I missing? Yeah. It kind of encapsulates that uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah, I relate to that a lot.
Just to go back to something you were saying earlier about psychoanalysis being really helpful in times like this. And you said something about tools to help us deal with it. So I'd be curious to, like, very specifically, what do you mean by the tools? Is it simply having spent the time to go sift through in a very systematic way and in the proper supportive environment your past, so that you're not reacting based on subconscious triggers to the complications of the world? Is that what you're referring to?
It's many things. I mean, yes, it's partially that. I'm hesitating a little bit because I don't know how political we want to get.
To be as comfortable as
Okay.
you want. There are no guardrails here.
Okay. Let's say someone comes in and they're, like, as all of my patients are, utterly rattled by what's going on in the world, in our country and beyond. Utterly rattled. I mean, my practice is like, so there are many ways that thinking psychoanalytically helps, first of all, me be in a state of mind where I can be helpful to other people, but also the tools that the analytic work gives people include things like seeing your mind getting, let's say, fearful or angry or full of revenge fantasies. Watching your mind do that. And you watch your mind and you can understand where it's coming from in yourself, whether it's coming from, let's say you had a tyrant of a parent and your entire life is devoted to, like, freeing yourself from that kind of childhood, and then you suddenly have this administration and you feel like you're being bullied all over again. So being able to kind of understand your own reactions, both through your personal history and being able to see what's going in front of you, what's happening in front of you, and how it's triggering you. So being able to have the tools to, in a way, modulate, understand your own reactivity, not for you to dumb it down and, like, become passive, but to understand what's going on, not fall under the spell of what's going on, kind of keep a clear mind so you know what to do with yourself, with your children, and then what are you going to do about the world, rather than become just overwhelmed and, like, pass it on to the next person you see on the subway. It's having a mind. And then being able to see kind of large group processes from a psychoanalytic perspective is very helpful. How we're all driven by all sorts of unconscious forces and more and less primitive forces that you have a choice between. And there are certain ways that I see what's happening right. I've written about it. We're kind of tempted to fall into what in psychoanalytic jargon we call kind of a splitting state of mind, where it's all like good and bad. We're almost like drawn into this comics world in which there are evils and good people, and it's a very primitive way of thinking that we all have that in us. I mean, from a very young age. And psychoanalysis gives you kind of tools to understand that as a developmental phase that you retreat into when you're feeling threatened. And then to imagine what it means to work your way out of that, and to be able to kind of invite yourself to not be stuck in that, because it's such a toxic mind space. Am I making sense?
You are. I'm thinking. I'm particularly interested in this splitting state of mind, and I'm I'm trying to formulate a question and make sure it's clear and not annoying. And if it is,
that's fine. It can be annoying.
Okay. I appreciate you creating a supportive environment in that regard.
Yes. I'll use my tools.
One of the things that I try to do on this show is, because we get people, we've had an enormous amount of luck at getting people who are leaders in their field, and sometimes they're coming in talking about quite a complex field that requires some mastery, like psychoanalysis. This is not most listeners are not in psychoanalysis. Most listeners haven't done a lot of internal family systems either. Most listeners haven't done somatic experiencing or all the various, or haven't gone on a 10-day silent meditation retreat. So I am always trying to extract doable little practices that a listener, even if they are not deep in whatever tradition we're discussing, can apply in their own lives. And so I'm wondering whether there's some bootleg version of what you would talk about with your patients when it comes to splitting that anybody listening to this show could apply to their own lives given the current political context.
Yeah, I've actually been trying to do that. I appreciate you asking it in this way and the ginger way you're doing it. But I've really been trying specifically to focus on this concept of splitting and trying to translate it into a language that is not jargony and that can be useful to people, because I think, especially during this time in history, it's maybe the most useful concept that psychoanalysis has to offer right now. Splitting is a state of mind. It's not... it's a state of mind that we all are familiar with. We may forget that we're familiar with it. We may think that we're better than that, but we all know what splitting feels like. First of all, because we all went through the phase of splitting as infants and as young children, where we want to preserve some good feeling about ourselves or about the people we're close to, and then we assign all the bad stuff to outside of ourselves. So we think of ourselves as only good, as having benevolent, generous qualities, and all the greed and meanness and envy of the world is outside of us. Think of sibling relationships, right? All the bad is on the brother or the sister, and I'm the good one, always, as young people. And it's a way to try to build a sense of goodness in oneself, to feel coherent, to maintain bonds with people. And as we become more sophisticated and mature, and let's say if we have like a good enough environment to support us, we become able to tolerate more complexity, more contradiction, more nuance, both in ourselves and in the people around us. So when you become more mature, you can understand that the same mother that feeds you and dresses you and keeps you alive and warm is also the mother that was late to school and didn't have time for you that day and was mean to you one morning. And it's the same person, and those qualities are all in her. Or your best friend that suddenly did something like really nasty, and it's actually the same person, and you can have like complex feelings about them. And you know what? You're also both decent and a shit sometimes. So that way of like integrating like a more nuanced and complex version of yourself and of reality, it's not good branding, but we call it in psychoanalysis, that's the depressive position, where you come down from like the comic world of like good and evil, and you're into this like depressing reality of, yeah, both and good and bad, and things are more complicated than you think. But being in that quote unquote depressive position is actually a very powerful place, because you can forgive, you can see reality more clearly. You can forgive others. You can forgive yourself. You have more compassion. You see things as they are, rather than from a defensive posture. So that's my little summary of splitting. And you know, the way things are in our political system, and especially coming from like the ultra right, it's all about splitting. It's all, every sentence is all to induce splitting. It's kind of amazing.
I would argue that the social media algorithms which reward outrage produce splitting in a quite bipartisan fashion.
Totally. They produce splitting both in the outrage language, but also just by the mere fact that it's about the clickbait. So economically, you're encouraged to split. You're encouraged to just go down a deeper and deeper rabbit hole, which is like the extreme version of splitting.
Yes.
It's economically just better for whatever the app we're using and whoever's selling whatever they're selling.
There's a lot of money to be made by inducing splitting.
Yes. It all comes down to like capitalism. Right.
A couple of little practical phrases popped into my mind as I was listening to you speak, and I want to run them by you. Just by way of context, I'll state my priors out loud here. I'm deeply influenced by, there's a meditation teacher named Joseph Goldstein, who is an 81-year-old, he'll be 81 soon, sort of eminence Grease, Dharma guy, who I have become friends with, and he's been my teacher for about 15 years, and I really love him. And one of his teaching methods is to have these pithy little phrases that, if you hear them enough, will start emerging in your mind when you need them. And he did not come up with this. I mean, this is a venerable,
like koans.
Yes, it's a venerable Buddhist tradition and a spiritual, contemplative, philosophical way of helping people put these concepts to use in their own lives. And so two little phrases, neither of these come from Joseph, but they do come from Buddhism, might help turn down the volume on splitting. One is just like me. So when you look at people on the quote unquote other side, well, just like me, they want to be happy. Just like me, they're doing what they think is right. Very few people wake up in the morning hoping to be the bad guy. And again, this should not lead to, passivity. It's just a way to get you into the depressive state so you can make a more nuanced diagnosis and then plan of action. And then the second little phrase that I like, and this comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Zen master, is, "Am I sure?" Like, I'm
great.
I'm reading the paper today, and it's making, or my algorithm is making X political figure look like a complete asshole. But am I sure? Am I sure? Like, maybe there's a case for tariffs. I don't know. Check it out.
Yeah, I deeply resonate with both of these. Just like me, and am I sure? It's interesting. I have a lot of arguments with my closest people. I have like a group, like a writing group that we think together and argue about all of this a lot. And the people in my group that object to this just like me position are threatened by it implying non-action. I know that's sort of the when I tried to write about splitting for the Times, like the most intense pushback. It was like one of the pieces that I wrote that was a kind of a benign piece, and I had such intense pushback exactly with the same complaint that I'm not seeing like the moral and ethical flaws of the administration, and how can I even think to ask or to say to myself, just like me. And I understand the critique of this, but I do find when I listen to people, it's, when I work with couples, for example, I listen to each side of the conflict. And when I listen closely to each person in my couples practice, if I really listen carefully, I get where they're coming from. Even if they're talking about doing things that are to their partner seem absolutely hurtful and outrageous, I get where they're coming from. And then I listen to their partner, and similarly, I get where they're coming from. And I can imagine myself, most of the time, I can imagine myself into the shoes of that person. It doesn't mean that's where we end. I mean, there's got to be you got to then apply some sort of, like, whether it's ethical standards or mutual negotiation, something needs to happen then. But I think that the just like me is incredibly important, an incredibly powerful listening tool. I had this conversation with, I'm in close contact with this lovely Palestinian woman, and I'm part Israeli, and she's Palestinian and very a serious activist, and we've engaged in many, many, many hours of conversation over Zoom and sometimes in person. Sometimes she comes to New York and we meet in person, trying to listen to each other on this like Palestinian-Israeli nightmare conflict. And we say things that are very hard to bear to each other, but we try to kind of enter this state of like imagining ourselves into the shoes of the other with the history that each of us brings, our history, again, transgenerational history, what we even call history, the differences in what we understand is history, what's relevant, what's not relevant. And then we create this kind of DMZ, this kind of demilitarized zone between us. And then we go back to arguing about the actual issues on the ground, but constantly going back to this DMZ, to this place where we can find commonalities or find a way to imagine ourselves into the experience of the other. It's very helpful.
I get why people fear that it's going to lead to non-action or passivity, but I think ideally it leads to wise action, because hatred and rage don't tend to lead to the best decisions. And even if you set that aside, they're pretty unpleasant, toxic states of mind for you to live with. Better to tune into compassion, in my view, and that doesn't mean forgiving, blessing the behavior of the other person. There's a great story from Sharon Salzberg, another eminent Buddhist teacher who was over in India back in the 60s and 70s learning about the Dharma from older teachers, and said to one of the teachers, well, what am I supposed to do if somebody tries to mug me? And the teacher said, you compassionately hit them with your umbrella.
Okay, well, that goes my association to that. I mean, not funny at all. Is there used to be this? It's probably still true in Israel. There used to be this saying. In Hebrew, it's yorim v'bochim. It's in English, it's shooting and crying. Like the Israelis used to have this idea of themselves as compassionate while they're killing. They're crying while they're killing. I mean, of course, I think that fantasy is long gone. But
another expression that's coming up. This is a bit more on the understanding where everybody's coming from. So it's not a direct response, but it picks up on the theme that we've been exploring of, can you understand where people you disagree with are coming from, and still take effective action in the world. But there's a expression I heard from a Cuban friend. I might mangle this, but it's "Cada loca con su tema," which is every crazy person has their story, and we all have our story, which is which goes right to the heart of psychoanalysis, which is, do you even understand your own? The person in my group that mostly pushes, Jade, my friend Jade, who mostly pushes back on me very hard on this just like me attitude. She says that it's a stance of privilege, that to try to free your mind from, like you're saying, from states of hatred, you can do that when you're comfortable enough. But when you're really under the boot of whatever the situation is, it's not about freeing your mind. You can only hate and rage and be violent because otherwise nothing will change. Like there's always this debate among activists of like nonviolence, violence, and when violence. Not a simple question. No.
And not to mention that there's so much violence that is done in the name of the good.
I'm not here to dismiss. I mean, I genuinely do not dismiss Jay's argument. I think there's something to it. And I'm not, I also don't want to hold myself up as an expert here, because there's a lot of a lot of learning I'm sure I still have to do. I guess I think about it less from a macro perspective and more on a micro perspective. Like,
Mhm.
what do you, listener, or you, Orna, or what do I, Dan, want to be my mind state as I move through this world, whether I have privilege or not? And we all have various forms of privilege, and we're all marginalized in one way or another. Some of us, myself, I have more than my fair share forms of privilege.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of that, or at least I try to be. But what do I want my mind state to be? You know, what do I
Yeah.
want the quality of my life to be? And how effective do I want to be? And I just think the data show that you're less likely to be happy and healthy, and also simultaneously less likely to be successful in an abiding way at whatever your goals are, if your fuel is hatred, resentment, spite, anger, and all those things are natural. They are going to come up. They come up in my mind, even with all the
Yeah.
privilege I have. But like, what do you want to be tapping into as the cleanest burning fuel going forward? And it just seems to me that all the data point toward the cliches of love and compassion, and it's annoying
Yeah.
to hear. And but I kind of think it's true.
I do too. I mean, at the end of the day, I totally do. And I do think that love is a much more powerful force than hate. That's why I do what I do. Yeah, and I do think that's something that has to be cultivated internally. That it's not, you can't expect it from the world. You have to, it's a practice.
Yes.
It's an action.
I want to ask you in 1 second, what do you mean? How can we cultivate that internally? But let me just say to Jade, whose argument I take very seriously, my understanding of love and compassion does not rule out smacking somebody with your umbrella. Like,
Yeah.
you can do pretty much all the same things you would do in a state of anger and rage with a mindset of compassion. You can take many of the same actions. It's just, there's a tweak, there's a change in the internal posture that makes you more effective over the long term. That's my understanding,
Yeah.
with all of my flaws and caveats and privileges and all that.
Yeah, maybe the nuance there is the difference between a state of love and compassion and a state of comfortability. I think being comfortable as a goal induces like passivity and compliance, and going along with the idea that love is the most powerful force. Like, being in a state of compassion and love it's hard. It's not, I mean, sometimes it's wonderful. Sometimes it's a transcendent experience, but sometimes it is hard. Like when I'm talking with Christine, this Palestinian colleague of mine, and she challenges me to remain connected to her and to remain empathic to her experience, and really widen my scope to understand the plight of somebody else and somebody that I might be implicated in harming. It's hard. It's ultimately awesome in the sense of awesomeness. But yeah, I ultimately would much rather spend my life in that state than in the state of knowing and hating, and I'm clear what's good, what's bad, and
Yes.
yeah.
I think maybe one thing you're pointing at, I think, is in some ways when you start using words like love and compassion, it's easy for that to induce a splitting mindset for people, because they're thinking of a cartoonish version of love and compassion as opposed to what it actually is, which is like changing your father's diaper even though he was mean to you when you were a kid. Like, it's being in the room and non-reactive while your child is throwing a horrifying tantrum. It's sitting with your friend who's on the other side of a geopolitical fissure. It's much grittier than Hello Kitty.
Yeah, it's not rom-com.
No.
Yeah.
So you said something before about, love is, and I think this is apropos. Love is not. It is something you cultivate internally. Do you have any thoughts on like what how one does that?
Yeah, I have many thoughts. I mean, it's sort of a large part of what I do in my practice. There are many ways to think and talk about it. I mean, one is I'm going to distinguish between like doing it in the presence of another person or other people or an outside entity, and with oneself. But really, it's the same thing. Like what you were talking earlier about, like a certain kind of stance that one can take. You can adopt a stance of deep curiosity for the story or the plight or the experience of the person you're with. And you have to kind of observe your mind. We all are very quick to rush to judgments, to comparisons, to kind of making things kind of clear to ourselves. Oh, this is good. This is bad. This is better. I'm better. He's better. And to kind of constantly try to let go of that kind of an impulse to differentiate and instead listen with that kind of beginner's mind, or, like Keats' negative capability, and try to immerse yourself in the experience of another for something new to come at you, for the world to bring you new things. Not what you know already, but kind of assuming, trusting that will elicit in you all sorts of feelings, good feelings, like curiosity, like empathy, like understanding, this very delightful experience of learning something new. How fun is that? It's a state of mind, and you can have that state of mind. That's in a way, in psychoanalysis, that's the state of mind you try to cultivate in analytic practice, which is that a person, I mean, it's a classic idea of someone lying on the couch and free associating. Doesn't exactly happen like that all the time, but the idea is you're letting your mind, your psyche kind of roam, and you're listening, not because you know about yourself, oh, I'm that kind of person, I'm that kind of person, but you're actually listening to new things that are going to emerge, and you try not to judge, not to foreclose, but listen with a stance of openness and curiosity. And I think that's kind of the fastest route to a state of benevolence and love.
You're reminding me of an excellent essay. Are you familiar with Maria Popova?
Yeah. I get her mailings. Yeah, so good.
Yeah, so I get her mailings too, and she's been on this show. Up for the listeners, I'll drop a link in the show notes to my conversation with Maria, who I think is an extraordinary human being.
She's wonderful, yeah.
And she was writing this essay, and she was quoting another extraordinary human being who's also been on the show a couple of times, George Saunders, the novelist, whose big theme is empathy, really. And Maria talked about how, nothing, not one single thing hurts us more than our certainties. And it's just like this moat between us and the world. It's this kind of psychological armoring that deadens and our lived experience. And then she quotes a lot from George Saunders talking about how reading, especially if you read the right authors, can put you in a state of mind where you, first of all, you're empathizing with characters whose POV might be different from yours, and then it's inducing, I believe the words George uses are like kind of like a holy befuddlement, a constant state of reconsideration. In fact, George describes some great Russians' work as reconsideration machines. And that may seem like, oh, is that related to love? Well, it is related to love in that, like, what is love if not openness and a desire to understand? And if you can train yourself in that's kind of that's the grittier, deeper version of love than you and I are talking about, as opposed to its rom-com rendering.
I, by the way, just listened 2 nights ago. David Sedaris reads a George Saunders short story. So good. The Letter. It came out in the New Yorker. It captures that. It's very important for this moment. Anyway.
So this openness, this reconsidering, what what habits of mind can we develop, especially for those of us who are not in psychoanalysis? What practices that can we bring into our own life that might kind of make this a state we can inhabit more frequently?
It's funny. The first thing that came to my mind was fact checking. But, and I don't really only mean it like literally, but I mean it in, you were saying earlier, am I sure? Like, notice when are you, we're always grabbing onto things to have some sense of certainty, but you can notice that it's happening. And we need it. I mean, especially, the world is so chaotic and scary and we're so vulnerable to it. So we need to grab onto things, but we can also ask oneself, like, why am I feeling so certain right now? Or what am I feeling right now? Is there a certainty that is seeping in here to make me feel safer in this moment? And okay, maybe I need that right now, but can I be honest with myself? Am I going to feel this way tomorrow? I have been watching my mind super carefully when I listen or watch the news, when I read the news. Those are moments for me super important right now, to watch my mind. When am I grabbing onto something because I'm anxious, because I'm something, and what's happening to my mind? Am I being twisted into a state of like rage, vengeance? Is this evoking understanding and curiosity in me? What is this doing to my mind, this thing I'm reading?
I sometimes think about, and I've tried to craft like a social post about this, but I haven't been able to come up with a way to say it that doesn't get me canceled. But it's like picking up on your fact checking notion. It's like, don't be manipulated by the algorithm. As we discussed earlier, there are people who have a lot to gain by inducing outrage and splitting in you. That doesn't mean if you read the front page of your favorite paper, it's wrong per se, and that they're the bad guys per se, or they may not even know they're doing it. So, like, let's not split again, but just check. It's just check. Or like, okay, certainty has arisen. Or actually, one little back to Joseph Goldstein, one of his little phrases is, certainty is not an indicator of truth. Maybe the arising of certainty in the mind can be a kind of alarm bell. All right, what's going on here?
Yeah. Yes, I have I've been recommending it to my students a lot, to consume multiple news outlets and not from the same side. Not because, I the other day, I listened to Joe Rogan. Believe me, not because I want to take in anything he has to say, but I want to know how different entities, different groups, different collectives are shaping reality. So I will know what's happening to my way of shaping reality. So I'm not too certain. Not because I want to take in that version of reality, but I want a check on my sense of certainty.
Yes.
And similarly, I try to read like international news. I read Al Jazeera, even though it sometimes drives me insane. But it's really good for the mind to not be manipulated, not be drawn into a state that ultimately prevents you from being wise.
I really I resonate with that deeply, and part of maybe my training as a journalist, but I have this nagging question in the back of my mind all the time, which is, what is the other side of this argument?
Right.
And so for example, with all the Trump stuff, I come. Speaking of one's priors, I was raised in the People's Republic of Massachusetts by like ultra liberal, overeducated physicians, and went into the news media, which is dominated by liberals. And my whole world is, I'm in a bubble. I'm in New York, and so I'm constantly like listening to Ben Shapiro, or not constantly, but occasionally trying to listen to people I know I'm going to disagree with, because
Yeah.
sometimes, I realize, oh, I'm not seeing this correctly, and that's
Right.
really painful. Or this morning I was listening to the Commentary Magazine podcast, where I try to check in with those guys occasionally, and they were just much more sanguine about Trump stuff that is putting the left on red alert. And they're not pro-Trump per se, but it's just very interesting to. And I'm not saying one side's right or anything like that. I'm just
Yeah.
saying this is useful befuddlement, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. You called it holy befuddlement. That was so good.
That's from George. One last thing to say, and I don't want to take up too much airtime here, but there is a difference between, when you self-gaslight in this way, it's not, you can change your opinions, but it's not supposed to be about changing your values. So
Right.
like, I can listen to people I disagree with, but it doesn't make me pro cruelty.
Yeah. That's one of the things that worries me so much about this rhetoric of splitting, that it's like a spell that can make people forget the ethic of protecting the vulnerable. I mean, a kind of thing that most of us kind of took for granted, like that's not in question. But there are kind of spell states that can lead you to kind of forget that, dissociate from that very basic value. We're living in dangerous times, dangerous to the mind.
Yes. There are a couple of things I want to touch on before I let you go. We did talk about, well, you did make a reference to transgenerational history, and I would love to hear a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, transgenerational history is obviously a giant topic that can pertain to one's very personal history. You can, let's say there was, I'm just making stuff up. Let's say there was a suicide in the family 2 generations ago that no one talked about, but it haunts the family in a certain way. Like there's a certain energy around the secret. It is transmitted through the way people raise their children, a certain kind of quiet around certain things, or certain habits that conceal truths. Those can get passed down across the generations and implant certain anxieties or patterns of thinking in each of us. You don't know. You have to, I mean, if you spend time in analysis, or if it doesn't have to be an analysis, you can spend time like really collecting your history and asking and getting interested, and suddenly you realize, oh my God, there's this thing that happened like 2 generations before I was born that is shaping who I am, that can be profound to discover and release one from a certain kind of haunting or grip. And similarly, it doesn't only pertain to like personal history. There are big histories that are passed down to all of us. For me, for example, it had a lot to do with like the history of like the relationship of Israelis to the Holocaust, and how it shaped our understanding of what it means to be Israeli, and how it blinded a certain kind of Israeli way of narrating history to the plight of the Palestinians. It's big. Like the transgenerational stuff that's passed down to us it can be huge. I mean, here it can be whether it's the history of slavery, of like the history of like how this country was like built on the destruction of Native Americans, and ways in which these histories are buried but continued to haunt the culture in ways that are systemic and unspeakable. It's interesting and powerful stuff.
Yes. I'm going to invoke again my the permission you gave me earlier to be annoying.
Cool.
This has implications, understanding your transgenerational history on a micro scale, like in terms of your own lineage, and also on a macro scale in terms of the broad sweep of history, it has implications for your intimate relationships, which brings me to something I want to make sure I ask you about before I go, which is your TV show. Do you think I'm right about this? That like we have these like I think of personally for me, I have two little inner characters in my dramatis personae internally. Like one I've called RJ after my grandfather Robert Johnson, who was this kind of mean, stern guy who he's sort of a personification of my inner critic and my outer irritation. And another, my great grandfather, who I never met, who was a hustler, Jewish guy, came here from the Pale of Settlement in the Ukraine in the early 1900s, and like became a criminal and ultimately took his own life because he had gotten indicted by the FBI, and the family found him in the kitchen. He had put his head in the oven, and so like I have a very like fear-based, ambitious side of me that if I don't see it, I can get carried away by it. And these two characters can fuck up my marriage if I'm not aware of them and being willing to call them out and bring them into the room and work with them. And so I'm just curious, does any of that ring true to you? And do you see that among your patients on television or behind the scenes? Yeah,
first of all, totally rings true. And it's kind of beautiful the way you're describing these characters. It's sort of like a novel. But yes, it's very true. In the show, the time I spent with couples in the show was a maximum, except one couple that we kept for longer. It was a maximum of 20 weeks. So it's not, it's a decent amount of time to do therapy, but it's not enough time to really, really sink into transgenerational stuff. But there was one couple in which it's interesting. They were each of they came from very different families and very different class systems. She kept feeling deeply insecure in the sense of constantly worrying that they're about to get into trouble, that things are not going to be okay, that they're going to get divorced, that just things are going to be bad. And he was like on a much firmer footing. And eventually we did get into some of the family histories that, like transgenerational histories. And she talked about how she came from kind of deep poverty, and every generation prior to her, the men were alcoholics that left the wives, left the family, like dysfunctional, deeply dysfunctional. That was like every generation that preceded her. And she was like, I cannot imagine a situation in which that's not going to happen here. And he was like, I don't know. I come from like a very steady family. This is our life together now. I want you to join my history. Like, jump out of your movie and come into my movie and expect this future. So yeah, it's very interesting when couples really have the time and space to get into their, like, who are the RJs that they're holding inside them, and who's talking to who between them. Like the couple can be talking between them, but it could be grandpa talking to grandma through them.
Yes. Yes. I sometimes think about like interpersonal communication as this miracle, but also like mostly it's a disaster, and it's persona talking to projection. Like in that scenario, like nothing can happen. It's just so hard.
Yeah. I think it's one of the reasons I see a lot of patients now going into psychedelics. It's like the trend. I think that's one of the reasons that people are going to psychedelics. They're trying to kind of find a quick way to shed all of that and have at least a few hours where they're like, it's a little bit less persona to projection. But it's quick fixes. They don't really work.
Okay, back to my being potentially annoying here, and I know you're, as you said before, a little skeptical of advice, given that a strategy can land in the mind of somebody who hasn't reconciled with their history and their predilections, and so the strategy doesn't mean anything. But given that you've done no small amount of couples counseling, couples therapy, and that's the name of the TV show, are there strategies that you could recommend, with all the caveats that, everybody's mind and life are complex and there's no silver bullet, no quick fix, but are there strategies that you can recommend that might put us in the direction of healthier interpersonal relationships?
It depends on the day and who I saw yesterday. My answer will depend on what just happened. There's so many different ways to answer that question. Maybe to build on what we've been saying in this kind of profound conversation, I think if you're in a couple and you're in trouble, usually there's a kind of a story each person tells themselves about their partner, and they usually get pretty dogged about their story with a lot of certainty. They know their partner. They know what's wrong with their partner. If you can come at yourself with a certain kind of practice of, let's say, using what we've said so far, like less certainty and more curiosity. So first of all, kind of try to wipe the slate and listen to your partner afresh. What are they actually saying? What really matters to them? And really make a distinction between what am I convinced of and I'm trying to find in what they're saying just to reassure myself that I know what's going on, versus what are they saying? Am I listening anew? Am I listening with a fresh mind to actually try to hear them, which is hard. It's hard to actually hear another person. We're working through so many personas, projections, certainties, like to actually try to clear the field a little bit and hear them anew and what matters to them in that moment. That kind of experience can go a very long way to get people out of a troubled space. And then there's another question you can ask yourself, which is, if I'm so troubled about something outside of myself, how can I take it back into myself? Well, why is this bothering me so much? Why am I so out of my mind because, I don't know, they left the dishwasher not turned on?
I love that. So a great question to ask yourself in moments where you're worked up about something. It really could be anything, but specifically in your romantic relationship, is like, why is this bugging me so much?
Yeah.
What's going on?
What's going on with me?
Yes.
Like, forget, okay, they, she, he, me. What's going on with me? What is my problem here? And can I take care of myself?
This may be a therapeutic cliche, but I like it. And I'll say it out loud and see if you like it. If it's hysterical, it's historical.
Oh, this is good. I never heard that one. Writing it down. I might have to use it in my book. It summarizes Freud's original work. Freud started the majority of his early work was with hysterics, so-called hysterics, which were women that presented with all sorts of weird symptoms like hysterical blindness. They couldn't see suddenly, even though there were no neurological reasons, or they were paralyzed in one arm in a way that doesn't conform to the neurological system. All sorts of funky symptoms. What Freud and his colleague at the time, Breuer, what they did that was so revolutionary is, rather than treat these women with all sorts of cold baths and assuming that they're of what they called feeble minds, they sat down and asked them to talk to them. They listened to them, asked what happened. Tell me about what happened. When did this begin? What happened just before? And lo and behold, as they were listening to the patients, the symptoms kind of relieved themselves, like they were cleared of symptoms. Like, and at the time, it was like absolutely revolutionary. First of all, listening to a woman was revolutionary, but listening to patients as opposed to like coming at them with some kind of authoritarian regime was a revolution. If it's hysterical, it's historical. That he believed that all hysterical symptoms are histories that have been repressed.
Mm.
So, for example, this was like a funky, tiny little example of someone who had this like horrible cough and couldn't swallow, refused to swallow liquids. And then it turned out when Freud was asking her, when did it start? It turned out that she saw a dog drink water out of a cup, and it kind of disgusted her. And from that moment on, she refused to drink. But until she kind of recollected that memory, she couldn't like get rid of that symptom. I mean, that's kind of a very simplistic example, but obviously there were like serious traumas that these women have repressed, like all sorts of like sexual coercion and sexual abuse that has been kind of repressed and showed up in symptoms. So yeah, that sentence is a good summary of early Freudian analytic theory.
Maybe this is a good place to close it. One of the critiques that I've heard, to the extent that I know much about this, but one of the critiques I think I've heard about Freudian analysis or psychotherapy generally is that it can bring you understanding without relief. I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think understanding is a form of relief. But what's your take?
I think anything can be used, any therapy can be used defensively. It can be used not to change. We don't like change. It's hard to change. And I think there is a way that you can use a psychoanalytic process in a way to just convince yourself of why you should stay the same.
I'm laughing because it sounds like something I would do. Probably have done.
We all do that. we all do that. But, in good analytic work, that will not go very far. You can do it for a while and then it's just not going to hold water. But that's a risk. And you have to have like a good analyst, and you have to, that will push you and not let you just like stay the same.
I think I've heard people in the past say, okay, I went and I talked to him in my childhood and I get it. My dad was a dick or whatever. And, but what do I do about it? And I think what you're saying is, well, actually, if you go in with the intention of understanding so that you can be liberated from it, meaning that you're not so owned by it, swamped by it all the time. It's not all coming back every time there's an external trigger. And you have a therapist who doesn't let you hide, or at least doesn't let you hide for too long. That actually, that therapy, that understanding can be a path toward genuine relief. Absolutely.
There's no way that you won't change if that happens. You won't change by way of like, oh, now I have like the 3 things I know what to do. You're just going to change deeply. It's not a change like, next time someone reminds me of my father, I'm going to say this, that, or the other. You're just going to feel differently about everything. You change from within. So yeah, you will change.
There are roughly 75 things I could ask you about in addition to everything we've discussed, but we are pretty much running out of time. I did hear you make a reference to the fact that you're writing a book, so perhaps we could use that as an excuse to bring you back.
Awesome. I would love that. Yeah. Can I ask you, so are you, from what we've talked, are you more interested in psychoanalysis?
For sure. I actually have a good friend who's quite a bit older than me, who is a practicing, what would you call it? He practices psychoanalysis. He's an analyst. Yeah. Yes. I'm not going to use his name just because he hasn't given me permission, but he's quite a respected local practitioner. And I've asked him about it a million times. And he's, elliptical in his answers, which this strikes me as on brand.
Yes.
But I am yes, I am intrigued, and because
Mm-hmm.
my whole world now is mining my own stuff to come
Yeah.
up with content that helps other people. So I am really interested in it. I bump up against the time thing,
Right.
but yes, short answer, yes.
Great. Good. Okay.
Before I let you go, can you just remind everybody of the name of the show that you're on, and any other resources or things you've written that you want my audience to know about in case they want to learn more about or from you?
I'm Orna Guralnik. I'm the therapist on the documentary series Couples Therapy. It was on Showtime, but it's now Paramount Plus. I write for the public in publications like the New York Times or the Washington Post, and I am writing a book, but it's going to take some time till it's out. And I have plenty of academic writing, but it's academic writing, so I don't know if it's for the public.
Do you have a website where all of this stuff is collected?
Yeah, ornaguralnik.com.
Great. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, everybody, if you want to learn more. In the meantime, such a pleasure. Thank you for making time to do this. I really enjoyed it.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for a profound conversation. So really appreciate it.